It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Becca Franks. Dr. Franks is a research scientist in the Department of Environmental Studies at New York University, where she studies animal behavior and animal protection, focusing on the well-being of aquatic organisms. With a doctorate in psychology from Columbia University and a Killiam postdoctoral research fellowship in animal welfare from the University of British Columbia, her work bridges diverse fields with the goal of understanding the interests, motivations, preferences, social relationships, and emotions of fish and non-fish species alike. I will go ahead and pass it over to you, Dr. Franks, and I will see everyone back here for the Q&A.
Wonderful, thank you so much. Can you hear my audio okay? Sometimes I have some trouble with the audio. Is it coming through? Okay, excellent. Great, thanks. Well, thank you so much for inviting me here, and thank you all for attending. It's great to see so many people coming out on a Saturday, and you know, this event to understand aquatic animals and how we can do our best to protect them and respect them. It's great to see how much things are changing and moving in the right direction in this regard. So I'm going to share my screen. And you can see my screen now, I'm assuming?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, great. So, the title is a bit of a mouthful, and I think this beluga sturgeon might be looking a little skeptically at what I'm setting out to try to do here. But in terms of the biases and how correcting them can save us all, I'm really thinking about a beginning and sort of an invitation to reconsider some of our relationships rather than having a mapped out plan to a final known destination. So hopefully it counts as in that direction, even though it's a little ambitious. So let's see. First, I'd like to thank institutional and foundational support from various, sorry, I'm getting distracted, from various sources that have made this work possible, and I'm truly grateful to have such a diverse network of institutions and foundations backing this work. So the first thing I want to talk about is just doing a little bit of a brief survey of the harms that we inflict on fish, and thinking about three large categories: consuming fishes, living with fishes, and identifying with fishes. So just a few weeks ago, a 20-year retrospective review of global aquaculture came out in the journal Nature, and they talk about how aquaculture has really become integrated in the last 20 years into the global food system and is thought to contribute to food security. And we can see from this graph across the last 20 years, there's been a steady increase in the production of aquaculture, which does include algae, which is seaweeds, freshwater fish, mollusks, and other various aquatic organisms. So while there's some notion that we're increasing this production, there's a lot of costs associated with this increase, including antibiotic use, habitat destruction, working conditions, disease spread, greenhouse gas emissions. There's also the issue that by farming aquatic animals, we're not alleviating pressure on wild populations. So it's not a replacement model, it's an addition model. And also there's a lot of work now coming out suggesting that the aquaculture that's being generated for the most part on the large scale doesn't go towards feeding a hungry world. It's mostly destined for food secure markets. But one of the things that's talked about less is who is actually being obscured by this massive increase in production. Tonnage. So with some fantastic colleagues at NYU, we looked into the animal welfare risks of global aquaculture. And this paper just came out yesterday, so it's fresh off the presses in Science Advances. So what we did is the first issue is that aquaculture, unlike other forms of animal agriculture, measures the individuals who are being affected in tonnage, not as individual animals. And so the first thing that we need to do to even get a scope of how large this problem is calculate how many individual animals are being affected. And so here we have invertebrates, mollusks, which are like the clams and mussels, arthropoda, which is a large group, including shrimps and lobsters, and the chordata, which are the chordates. So this is like the bony fishes and other vertebrates. And so we calculated the number of individuals for each of these groups. And what we found is that the total, for a year production, there's billions upon billions of individuals involved, hundreds of billions likely, even just of bony fishes. And we have this dashed line here at around 70 billion, which is the total number of terrestrial animals involved in agriculture. So we're seeing now that the aquatic animals are now individually more numerous than terrestrial animal agriculture. Another massive difference with aquaculture compared to terrestrial animal agriculture is the number of species involved. So the data came from the FAO, and they list the species involved, but sometimes those categories are larger than a species. So this is an underestimate. So the FAO listing is an underestimate of the number of species involved. And we have these same groups, and we see that there's hundreds of chordates and dozens and dozens of arthropoda and mollusks and other invertebrates involved. And I'm going to focus in on the fishes here. And so this is just looking at the vertebrates. And so one of the things that we were really interested in, let me see if I was thinking about welfare of these individuals and how much knowledge there is about these hundreds and hundreds of species that are being used in aquaculture. And so what we plotted here is looking at if we could look up a species and find at least 5 publications on their welfare, we categorize them as 5+ welfare. If they had just 1 to 4 publications about their welfare, there's little welfare. And if there was no welfare or the species was unknown, it's one of these like aggregate categories from the FAO, then obviously we can't have any welfare publications about them. And so what we see is that there's some species that have a small body of welfare literature about them, but there's hundreds of species representing billions upon billions upon billions of individuals with little to no welfare, and billions upon billions of species and individuals that we don't even know their species identity. They're just getting lumped in as an unknown. So we can't even know how to begin protecting them if we don't even know what species membership they are. And so this really gets at the crux of one of the issues that we face with aquaculture, but just fish in general, is that we think of fish, we have this word fish, and it integrates across a massive number of diverse individual species. And in fact, there's not a notion that there is a singular fish that if you know about fish, if you know about one fish, you know about all fish. This is a misconception that we have. So, to be more specific about this, consider an Atlantic salmon and Nile tilapia, two important fishes that are farmed. So Atlantic salmon are born in freshwater rivers. They grow up migrating through the river, go to the ocean, where they spend several years migrating around the ocean, and then they return back to their very same natal river, swim upstream for a massive spawning event, and then they die. Nile tilapia, on the other hand, are freshwater species. They have defined territories and social structures that are stable across time. They engage in parental care and have social hierarchies, and live in multi-generation, essentially, families. So knowing about Nile tilapia welfare is not going to give you very good information about Atlantic salmon welfare and vice versa. They're just completely different species. So the idea that we don't have welfare information about hundreds of the species involved in aquaculture is a major problem because it's non-transferable knowledge. And then you could consider something like an Atlantic halibut. These are benthic fishes. They grow up to be 800 pounds. They can live for over 100 years. They go on annual migrations through the seamounts in the North Atlantic. And while they might be closer, evolutionarily speaking, to Atlantic salmon than they are to Nile tilapia, again, we're still just not going to be able to know how to take care of Atlantic halibut without any species-specific information about their welfare. So I think it's helpful to note the comparison to terrestrial animals here. So, you can think of the Nile tilapia, Atlantic salmon, Atlantic halibut as being as distinct as chickens and cows and elephants. And then the difference being that in aquaculture, we're actually also trying to farm elephants and hundreds of other species that are just as unique and diverse as the terrestrial animals that you could pick out at random, that we are not farming on land, but we are farming in the aquatic world. So there's some massive harms going on. And I should add also that we know that without the support of information about an animal's welfare through scientific literature, we can't create standards, we can't create regulations, we can't even assess how good or poor the welfare is of individuals without that base knowledge. So even though that base knowledge doesn't guarantee that we have good welfare, its absence does signal extreme risks. And most surveys of looking into how the lives of fishes and other aquatic species in aquaculture shows that they have, massive mortality rates, they have poor handling, they have major stresses throughout their life and disrupted social systems, and then extreme suffering and slaughter. So without these protection, there's going to be massive amounts of suffering for these species. So in contrast to the farming of fishes, we also are, and this is in the US, very engaged with living with fishes. So there's a huge wildlife import trade to the US with tens of thousands of shipments coming in of various groups of animals, but fish being the most. So we have tens of thousands of imports to the US of wild fish who, were minding their business, living out their lives, were captured, put into a container, and then shipped into the US so that people can have them in their homes, presumably because people like being around fish, find them to be attractive and ornamental. And again, here, fish were reported as weights, not as individuals like everyone else. So if we were to look at the number of individual fishes affected here, it would be in the billions again, in terms of the imports. And this is thousands of shipments coming in from all over the world every year coming into the US of wild fish. And again, we don't know the species identity. And so the scope is massive, and the regulations and what to do about this is a huge problem that has been addressed by research since the early 2000s. And this paper coming out more recently, thinking about stress and welfare and ornamental fishes, looking to aquaculture, but noting that mortality rates can be upwards of 70% for these fishes coming in. So we seem to love them, we love being around them on the one hand, but then also are inflicting a huge amount of suffering and death on the other as a consequence. And finally, identifying with fishes. So a few years ago, this paper, this article came out in the New York Times entitled "Fish Depression is No Joke." And it was sparked by the journalist being in a hotel that was keeping betta fish on the side dresser next to the bed. And she was looking at this betta fish and thought he looked depressed, and decided to look into that because she thought maybe she was being anthropomorphic. And in her investigations and reporting, she found that science actually was supporting the notion that fish can get depressed, they can live, and that they have complex mental lives. So there's now a huge body of research exploring the mental abilities of fishes. And here I'd like to just take a moment before I even get into the research to just pause for the massive diversity of fishes and the different shapes and the different body plans and the different sizes and the different colors and coloration patterns. So there's this huge diversity that we can tend to gloss over with the word fish. So these are just a small sampling of some of the science that has come out with respect to fish abilities. So archerfish can recognize humans as individuals. They can tell us apart, even though we might not be able to tell them apart. Sea bass and many other species can learn from each other, which sets the foundation for having cultural transmission of knowledge across generations. The cleaner wrasse are the smaller fish here, and they have cleaning stations where they have client fish that come and visit them, and they remember who is a resident and who is not a recognized individual that's visiting with them. They coordinate with each other and have a very complex way of engaging with their pairs, and then also with the client fish that come. Tusk fish and other fish have been found to use tools now. Giant manta rays have been shown to recognize themselves in the mirror, which is thought to be the foundation for self-awareness. And then the pufferfish, which we can't even see, he's in the middle as a little dot, building these giant nests and that are elaborate and very well cared for in this intertidal system that, you know, they'd get washed away quite quickly if he wasn't constantly working on it. So there's a huge, you know, complex mental lives happening, complex social relationships happening, finely tuned awareness of their environment and how to manipulate their environment. So they're living these really, really, really rich lives, and science has done a lot of good in uncovering that. And yet again, we have on the one hand, the fish being science showing that the fish are, you know, living these complex mental lives, and therefore we might think that warrants considering their moral status more seriously. But then on the other hand, as we realize that they have more complex moral lives or mental lives, using that as a good reason to study complex brain disorders in fish. So zebrafish now have become a very popular scientific model for studying all kinds of things. And they're being put in these very, you know, barren, pared down, highly dense environments. And they're used to study and model major human neuropsychiatric and drug-induced symptoms, syndromes. So that means like getting them addicted to nicotine, getting them addicted to alcohol, essentially making their lives miserable on purpose. So, you know, it seems rather unfair that, you know, first we don't consider them to be of importance, then science shows that they do have complex mental lives that should support further protections and further considerations. And yet it's that very same data that is used to promote their use as modeling human issues. So I wonder, if I was a fish, who might you blame for this? So I think, as usual, Aristotle might be a good candidate for drawing down to the source of some problems as well as insights, of course. So Aristotle was a promoter of the idea of the scala naturae, or the great chain of being, which is the idea that there is sort of a linear hierarchical ordering to the natural world, with God at the top, and then man, and then women, and then, you know, mammals going all the way down to fishes, and then plants, and then rocks. They even ordered rocks as having, you know, more important, you know, minerals like gold versus lead. But in this, you know, linear hierarchy, fish are at the bottom, and they're considered to be primitive and inferior to other animals. And we know, of course, that this is just not the right way to look at the world. The scala naturae is an incorrect model. That's just a biological truth. And yet, for some reason, it's a very sticky notion. So here's a paper talking about the scala naturae directly. And so they say the ancient scala naturae, you know, had this sort of way of thinking about the animal kingdom, with fish at the bottom being simple and humans at the top being complex. And these blobs are supposed to be related to like brain regions. So humans have the biggest brain with the most brain regions. And so they said, no, instead we need to have a modern theory. We have to have a new way of thinking about these issues. And so what did they propose? They suggested more or less exactly the same thing. So what has changed? We've lost the arrow. Humans have been kind of demoted to a secondary position. And we have some branching, some gestures towards branching, but still it's essentially a linear hierarchy, still being visually represented as a linear hierarchy, as though fish are somehow lower than the other animals. Here's another example. This just came out in Science a couple weeks ago. Here we have the arrow is back. And we have the evolution of a hearing structure, and somehow the evolution of hearing structures is supposed to pass through bony fishes on the way to humans. So this is problematical because it is just factually incorrect. Darwin, this is some marginalia from Darwin as he was developing his theory of evolution, represented the idea of evolution as a branching tree. And we know that that is the accurate way to think about living species, as a branching tree, not in a linear hierarchy. And there are cases and examples of modern science using this kind of imagery, but we still see these scala naturae creeping in all over the place. So go in depth a little bit more about the evolutionary perspective. One of the things that I've been really fascinated with recently is thinking about evolution and evolutionary time as I think about fish. So here we have a plot of millions of years before the present. So this is 600 million years before the present, and the number of families. In this case, this is a scientific family. So you have species, genus, family. So this is a large biological group. And what we're looking at is how the number of families changed over these 600 million years, which is a mind-boggling amount of time. But it's even more mind-boggling to think about how long Earth has been around. So Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years. Pretty much as soon as the Earth cooled enough to allow for life to form, we saw life appear. 3.7 billion years ago, life appears. But it goes along as a single cellular, simple form of life for billions of years. Then 0.8 billion years ago, we start seeing the first complex organisms and animals. So that's 0.8 billion years ago. That's 800 million years before the present. So this is off the chart here, even further back in time, the first animals appear. And then we have the very famous Cambrian explosion. So for some reason, something happened in the early Cambrian, and we see this massive diversification of animal fauna on the planet. And then it just goes at pace. And then what we see here with these dips are there's major extinction events throughout time, but basically a huge amount of family diversity coming about over these millions and millions of years. Now, this arrow at the edge of the Soluvian period is when we had our last common ancestor with fishes, hundreds of millions of years ago, during the age of the trilobites. So that means trilobites were ruling the planet. It was all about the trilobites. There are many, many trilobites everywhere, lots of different species of trilobites. And then there was also our last common ancestor with fishes. And so what changed over that time, we get all of these new families, all of this diversification. I also just want to point out that there weren't even trees back then. All of the life was underwater. So it was just a completely different planet, a completely different world. And we separated from fish that long ago and then went on our way. And so the question is, what did fish do? Are fish the same creatures as they were all of those hundreds of millions of years ago? No, of course not. They also diversified just as much as we did. So here's a representation of modern fish diversity. And again, if we can just take a moment to pause to look at the incredible forms and colors and different fins and different ways of being a fish. And I'll draw your attention here to this branching point because this represents the teleosts. And the teleosts are about 95% of all fish species alive on the planet today. And this is important because this branching event happened after we branched away from fishes. And if you want to include sharks as fishes, which most people do, you have to go even further back, 600 million years ago, really, really ancient time. And essentially, you know, from a biological perspective, we're all on the same branch. We're all, humans included. If you want to lump together sharks with, you know, the teleosts and the lungfishes from the coelacanths, with the other fishes, we belong in that system as well. So the idea of like a fish being a thing in the world is a really misleading concept. And hence you get a book like this, Why Fish Don't Exist by Lulu Miller, which has gotten really rave reviews and would be interesting to check out if you want to know more about this. So just in the last 10 minutes here, I want to talk a little bit more about this core misconception that we have that's revealed by our persistent use of the scala naturae and our inability to get away from it. So it's important to understand that any creature who is alive today is not primitive to any human, and they're certainly not our ancestors. So thinking that a fish is an ancestor or a snake or a reptile or whatever species that it is that we sort of tend to think of as being, you know, subordinate or lesser than human is like confusing your second cousin with your great grandparent. So if you can humor me, please consider someone who is your second cousin and then consider your great grandparent. If we think about our family tree, any animal who is alive today is on this level of cousins. These are extant species that have their own, you know, ancestors, and sometimes those ancestors are the same as our ancestors, but they are not the same thing as the ancestor. Of course, there's just a huge diversity of different species alive today, and we're related to each other, but the relationship is more akin to being cousins, not to thinking about them as our ancestors. And so when you have a plot like this with an arrow pointing towards humans passing through fishes, we're kind of getting this relationship sideways, where everything is with respect to the human, and then there is supposed to be this linear progression towards our inevitable, you know, supremacy at the top here. And so another reason that I think it's useful to think about this as a family tree is you can easily imagine the perspective of your cousin who you were just considering. And so you can consider that, well, you can make this plot, you can make this case. It would be wrong and strange to say that your cousins are your ancestors, but you could sort of visually represent it this way somehow. It would be incorrect, but you know, you're free to do that. But similarly, your cousin is free to do that, and she could make a plot quite similar. So here we have our cousin, the pufferfish, and considering her evolutionary heritage and all of the amazing, things that evolved that allowed her to be the pufferfish that she is. and all of the changes that happened through evolutionary history leading up to her modern form. And then all of her distant relatives that are alive today, like the hagfish and the lampreys, all the way at the end, the really sort of wormy looking beings that are very primitive, potentially from her vantage point as an amazing pufferfish. So we can then have a similar sort of idea that, you go through the hagfish and lamprey forms all the way up to the pufferfish form in a similar way to what we do when we make a Scalinatura with ourselves at the top. And what I love about this is that we actually are represented here. We're in with the lobe-finned fishes and the tetrapods being represented by this sort of somewhat sad looking lumpy creature. So from the pufferfish's perspective, that's where we belong on the Scalinaturae leading to pufferfish. But of course, pufferfish never get an opportunity to make those sorts of plots, and we are only making them usually about ourselves, with ourselves at the top, at the pinnacle. And it leads to this idea of self-evident human exceptionalism and human supremacy, unquestioned human exceptionalism and human supremacy, where it's almost silly and seen as being potentially naive and questionable to think that any other species could make a plot like what we do, because this is the only version of the story of natural selection and evolution that we tell when we talk about it from a Scalinaturae perspective. And I think that this sort of thinking underlies and supports and makes possible the mechanization of animal life, also known as factory farming and animal markets, those very things that are contributing to global pandemics and threatening our survival. It also is the sort of logic that leads to the notion that developing land has come to mean, destroying it, basically. The idea that developing land might be strip mining it, and the exploitation of natural resources, thinking about the natural world as a resource to be used, which is leading to habitat destruction, which is, of course, our own habitat, and climate change and climate crisis and catastrophe. So our separation of ourselves from the natural world and putting ourselves at the top of this linear hierarchy is very problematic, not just because it's factually incorrect, but because it's also supporting a way of thinking about the world that is incredibly damaging to us and to all other life on the planet. So what can we do? So just very briefly, again, I just want to have this to be an invitation of things to consider rather than a full-fledged map of what to do. But how can we save ourselves from ourselves and save our kin as our cousins and relatives? I think this notion of self-evident human exceptionalism without question has to go. We have to stop thinking this way. It's not helpful. And I think what we need to do instead is ground our respect for other beings in humility, compassion, and openness to learning from them in all of the unique and special ways that they have of being on the planet. And second of all, I think we need to also get rid of this us versus them separation. Our gains is nature's losses is our gains, zero-sum logic that we have in terms of thinking about our separation from the natural world, and instead get rid of this and replace it with seeking out opportunities for mutualism and reciprocity. So with these shifts in focus and shifts in orientation, we're thinking about our relationship with the rest of the world. I think that there's scope for using those shifts within the existing frameworks, thinking about how we can work within the systems as they exist already, but keeping these ideas in mind, despite the fact that the systems themselves are built around the notion of human exceptionalism and human supremacy. We can still work within them with an awareness that those are problematical ideas. And, as was mentioned in the introduction, in some jurisdictions, fish are not even considered to be animals. And this is, again, must be based to some extent in the Scalinaturae that they are somehow lesser than. There's no biological justification for thinking about fish as being not animals. But of course, this also brings up the notion that we might need to come up with new frameworks that undermine or seek alternatives, at least to a human supremacy, human exceptionalism model. And there's lots of great people working on these new alternative frameworks. You know, Manisha Deka has just come out with a fantastic book on beingness. Robin Wall-Kimmerer, who I'm using similar language about kin, has written extensively about this in respect to plants. There's lots of great work out there about thinking about how we can fundamentally change our relationship and change our frameworks for thinking about our relationship with the rest of the world. So I'm happy to talk about more specific ideas, but I think right now the thing that's most clear to me is that we need to change our orientation, and we need to change the relationship itself that's at the core, both in our everyday life and the way we walk through the world and just look at a tree or look at into a pond and see a fish or see a shrimp, but also then in terms of, you know, how our society is structured. And so with that, I'd like to thank you for listening, and I'd be happy to field any questions.
Thank you so much for that wonderful presentation, Dr. Franks. We'll now head into the Q&A session. As a reminder, please use the Q&A box to send your questions in. We've already got some good questions. Thanks for your great talk, Becca. I was wondering if there are any publications revealing correlations between farmed fish personality and their welfare, i.e. do risk-taking individuals, or are risk-taking individuals more or less able to cope with unexpected conditions or specific color preferences?
Yeah, I don't know of anything specifically for fish, but there are lines of evidence that we could use to reason through those questions. So first of all, there are many studies showing that fish have individual differences and personalities and preferences, and differences in their preferences and difference in their personality. So that we know for sure. And for sure, there's going to be differences in fish in terms of their preferences for risk-taking versus their preferences for, you know, safety and security. Then another thing that we know, mostly through terrestrial animal agriculture, is that individuals who are the most docile and the most sort of, not necessarily risk-taking, but the most calm and even could be considered shy, depending on how you measure it, actually are the ones who do best in captivity. This is likely for a number of reasons, one of which is that if you're an animal who's not used to being around human animals, this can be a threatening and scary situation. And if you're an individual who really sees that kind of context as being something to take action on and to flee or to be aggressive, you're going to do worse than an individual in captivity with a lot of humans around you. You're going to do much worse and be much more stressed out because you're not going to be given the opportunity to have express those sort of behavioral preferences than an individual who might have a more passive response. So I would imagine that something similar is happening in aquaculture, although I don't know of any specific research looking into that. And then the other thing that this is a great question that I should have mentioned in the talk that's very concerning, and another difference between aquaculture and terrestrial animal agriculture, is that most of the species in aquaculture are wild. So most of the species that, I think all of the species that we farm on terrestrial animal agriculture at this point have been domesticated, at least over several, 1,000 years. Most of the species in aquaculture are wild. They are not domesticated. They haven't been selected for, being at least passive or docile in captivity. So you have the potential for animals really having an incredibly stressful time under these sort of very constrained captive conditions with humans around them.
Another question. You are still using hierarchical language to describe the evolutionary progress of the pufferfish. Can the language be changed?
Yes, I was using hierarchical linear language to talk about the pufferfish. And I was trying to do that provocatively let's say a pufferfish would never presume to use hierarchical linear language, but if they did, this is how they would talk about it. So yes, absolutely, it's not sensible to use that sort of language, and it's just that it's a story that one could tell. It would be a wrong story, but it would be a story, and this is how the story would be constructed from a pufferfish's perspective. So yeah, what other language can we use besides hierarchical language? Well, I mean, I think one issue that I'm getting quite interested in sort of thinking about fixing is the visual representation of how we represent evolutionary relationships. So even the slide that I showed with sharks at the bottom and human beings at the top, even there, even though it was fish focused, and it was actually focused on the great white shark that was at the bottom, if you have a linear representation of evolutionary relationships, there's inevitably a focal center point that is like the anchor point. And in that case, it happened to have been the great white shark. But I think that it's something that has been underexplored within evolutionary biology, is that there's no way to make a linear representation of what is essentially a multidimensional space. And so if we are going to make a linear representation of that, usually what you would do is make caveats and be explicit about the choices that you're making about why you put one thing at one end of the spectrum and another thing at the other end of the spectrum. And that's essentially entirely absent. So I think that if we do want to have a visual representation of evolutionary relationships, it's going to be tricky because we're dealing with a two-dimensional space, a piece of paper or a screen, to represent a multidimensional relationship. And so we know that this is a huge problem, even just, from the earliest map making endeavors. Like, you can't project the globe accurately, a three-dimensional sphere accurately into a two-dimensional space. And so there's a couple of different solutions that you can make about thinking about how to do that, but they always come with trade-offs. And those trade-offs are well understood and well mapped. And so I think we need a similar conversation about the fact that we're trying to represent a multidimensional space in 2 dimensions, and there are going to be trade-offs and there's going to be misrepresentations inevitably. There's no way around that. That's just, actual math. So what's missing though is the acknowledgement and the recognition of the problems and the trade-offs and why you made a decision to put one species in one place and another species in another place. So I think starting the conversation is at least part of the beginning of an answer, if it's not the answer itself.
Thank you. In the US, we are often behind the 8 ball when it comes to animal welfare. Are there any countries that are ahead of the game in demonstrating concern for fish?
Yeah, actually, and that's very true. And the UK is currently, there's initiatives and pushes for various legislations being introduced. In Scotland, there's a huge amount of salmon farming, and so there's been a lot of interest there. And I think there's going to be progress soon. Interestingly, off the top of my head, one that comes to mind is you're not allowed to boil lobsters alive in, I think, Switzerland. Yes, Switzerland. So there are examples of countries in Europe that have restrictions in place against certain forms of extreme suffering that we still accept in the United States. And there's a huge amount of movement pushing for these things. Not a lot has come to fruition yet, but I think that the difference is that people are now pushing for it. Human beings are pushing for this, and so I think that's great. So I'm anticipating things to start shifting on the legal terrain as well.
Thank you. I think we have time for maybe one more question. Was there a particular event in your life when you realized that fish, for instance, are sentient individuals with great value and deserving respect as equals?
I always have been drawn to them. I don't know why. I grew up in Rochester, New York, in a landlocked place. But I just have always been drawn to them. I've always thought that they were beautiful and fascinating, and it just felt sort of like a science fiction novel that these beings existed on the planet and that I could sort of get a glimmer into their world. And so I had always felt that way. But I didn't end up working with them until I did my postdoc. And I went into that postdoc thinking, all right, I don't want to underestimate them. I want to, imagine that they are capable of, trying to undo this scala naturae, that they're sort of somehow going to be primitive. I'm not going to be able to understand them. They're going to be lesser. They're going to be less interesting. And I walked into that situation saying, I want to make sure that I don't do that. And I want to give them the benefit of the doubt. And I can always ratchet things down, but like, I don't want to put a cap on what I'm allowing myself to see. And so I walked into that situation with really high expectations. And even with my high expectations, they still blew my mind, and they were still more finely tuned to their environment, still more complex and fascinating, still more engaging and, mysterious. Not, I couldn't wrap my head around them, not because there wasn't anything there, but because there was so much more there than I'm used to thinking. And so it was in my postdoc that I really realized, like, it's not just sort of like a fun sort of pastime game for me to sort of play around with the idea that fish matter on an equal playing field to humans. It's really deeply true.
Thank you. One quick question. A couple of people have asked if you could give the authors titles of the two books you mentioned on New Ways of Being. One was Robin Wall Kimmerer.
Yeah, Robin Wall Kimmerer has a few books that are fantastic, and she also has some articles that are freely available. One that just recently came out in Emergence magazine, but her most famous book is Braiding Sweetgrass. So that's a fantastic book, and I highly recommend that. And the other book that I recommend that just came out this year by Manisha Dekka is Animals as Legal Beings, I think. I'm not sure if I'm remembering the title correctly, but it's just came out. And if you look up Manisha Dekka, you will find her book, and the one that just came out this February, I think.
Great. Awesome. Well, I'm sorry to announce that we're almost out of time for this session, and we have a lot of great questions out there I wish we could have gotten to. But if you have any further questions, you can reach out to Dr. Franks directly at the email address that I've entered into the chat box. Thank you so much for attending today's webinar, and special thanks to Dr. Franks for joining us and sharing her knowledge with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you.